Our discussion for today is politics on ham radio, not in ham radio. We're not going to talk about ARRL elections or any of the possible infighting in the hobby or anything like that. And we're not going to discuss either political party's side here in the United States or any other country for that matter. It's not about that. It's just about the topic of discussing it on ham radio. What do the rules say? What are some other considerations? We'll branch into that. Okay, so I'm going to spare you looking at my ugly mug throughout most of this, and I'm just going to use some notes here to kind of help guide the discussion as we go along, and just give you something sort of visual to look at as we're talking about this particular topic. When I go into this, again, I want to just reiterate this is not partisan in any way for anything here in the United States or in any other country. What we want to talk about is like FCC rules, procedures, and there's some other considerations that this particular topic will branch us into that we will also talk about. First of all, let's just answer the question that I'm going to pose here right off the bat. Do the FCC rules prohibit politics on amateur radio, political discussions, Republican, Democrat, whatever else in between, or discussing what the goings on in other countries for that matter, and what's considered a political discussion? And the answer to that is no. The FCC rules do not. One of the things that brought me to discuss this topic was it's probably been over a year ago. A local repeater, I was listening to some folks talk, and that's what I'll do in my shack a lot of times. I'll operate HF mostly and just monitor the local repeaters and listen in on the conversations. If I'm doing digital modes or something, I just use it as sort of a listening entertainment type thing. And there were some gentlemen talking about the upcoming presidential election at that time. And another fellow, and I recognized his voice, but I don't think he identified that day. But I kind of know who he was. I'm not going to name names or even name the repeater for that matter. Jumped in and he said, politics aren't allowed on ham radio. That's basically what he keyed up, and he's like, politics aren't allowed on ham radio. You can't talk about politics on ham radio. And pretty much put it out there as if it was an FCC rule. And it certainly is not. They don't explicitly ban political discussions due to First Amendment, and we'll jump into that as well, because there's some different aspects to look at when we bring up the First Amendment for this topic. We've also got to examine it for other things as well, and we'll get into that in a moment. The ARRL and in general ham radio culture would suggest that avoiding controversial topics like politics and religion kind of prevent arguments, maintain the civility of amateur radio. If you can speak with folks that you have opposing views with and keep it civil on amateur radio, and continue to show the example that ham radio should be compared to other things like 11 meters or whatnot, then, by all means. And again, this part is, as I say, that is just kind of a personal opinion. I've had folks that I've had opposing views with that we could talk about it in person and on ham radio, and we always kept it civil, even if we agreed to disagree. But I know the climates are changing these days, and you find someone with opposing views, there's not very many people left in the middle. It doesn't seem like, and that's just my opinion, that everyone's kind of extreme to their direction, and they get pretty passionate about it. So it's probably best to leave those things off of ham radio. But again, there's no rules or anything or laws that prohibit. I do know that there's folks that I can sit and talk about ham radios with all day long. Yaesu, ICOM, this kind of antenna, that kind of antenna, and even other topics, and we could talk all day long, but I know enough about them, and they probably know enough about me, that we just don't go there, whether it's political, or I can even branch out and throw religion in there as well, that it's going to cause a huge argument, and it's going to be a poor example for amateur radio. So imagine you've got somebody out there that's picked up a scanner that's got one of the little Chinese radios or whatever, or they just happen to be with a friend, and you're monitoring amateur radio, and all of a sudden, this big argument erupts or whatever. What kind of example is that going to be for them? Now, some folks may hear that and think, I want to jump in the middle of that, so I'm going to get my license, but that's probably a little more rare. So, for that reason, you may want to refrain from those type of activities, but again, not because it's a rule violation. Other countries, the political talk, it can have serious consequences. So yeah, if you're out there on HF and you're talking to other folks, just be mindful of that. I made a contact, and I won't name the country or even the station I made a contact on HF with a gentleman. This was digital mode, so we didn't have a really opportunity to discuss anything, but he was from another country outside the United States, and his QRZ page had some very derogatory things to say about the folks in power, in political power in his country, and it was stated in a way that was kind of humorous. But for everything we have here in the United States, there's probably another country where it's totally structured, totally different, and could be worse. So just be mindful of that when you're speaking to folks, and when you have the HF privileges and you want to talk about that. And it could even be that if you're on HF discussing what we've got going on over here in the United States, that can still be a sensitive subject for people in other countries. So just be mindful of that when they join in on your conversations or whatever, that discontent or whatever, some kind of a disturbance could erupt on amateur radio that maybe we don't want to have, as far as an example out there. This gets into that First Amendment thing. So the owners of specific repeaters, link systems, nodes, whatever, they may have their own content rules. The person that I referenced at the beginning, I know, was not the owner of the repeater that got on there and said, and of course he's also, the way he said it was no politics on ham radio. That's against the rules, That, of course, was a myth. The repeater owner maybe doesn't want that, but that wasn't the repeater owner, and he wasn't anyone that I would know to have any kind of control over that repeater. Like, for instance, club that I belong to here where I live, I was president of for up until a couple of years ago. I was president for several years in a row, and even now still have some responsibility in maintaining the repeaters that we have. I still have the codes to be able to shut off the repeaters and actually help police the repeater and maintain order. But I'm not the trustee. We have another gentleman that's a trustee, but there's several of us because the trustee can't always monitor the repeater. Just like a repeater owner may actually give out the codes to be able to shut down a repeater and say, hey, if you hear this or whatever, people will jump to say things like, well, I was on this repeater and I was talking about this or this, and it may not just be politics, maybe something else, but maybe let's go with politics. I was talking about politics, and the repeater owner came on and asked me to stop, and I asserted that, First Amendment and blah, 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 and I kept talking, but then he turned the repeater off. Well, that's not a violation of your First Amendment rights. You don't have a right, or let's say you don't have the privilege or the use of a privilege. Let's say that. The repeater itself is a piece of property owned by someone, either some entity or some individual. And those entities or those individuals can set certain rules. They can even say, I don't want you on there at all. I just want me and my buddies to be able to use it. I'm glad most repeater owners don't do that because it's really counterproductive. It seems like that's more of an accepted thing on GMRS than it is amateur radio. It's the repeater owner's piece of property. Whoever has effective control, if it's a organization or whoever owns the repeater and their designees, they can shut it off if they don't like you or what you're talking about. And that's just part of it. It doesn't stop you from using that pair of frequencies to try to communicate or anything because they don't own that portion of it, but they own that piece of equipment up there and on that mountaintop or that hillside or whatever. And that's their prerogative if they want to turn it off for whatever reason or whoever happens to be on there. So I'm just trying to explain kind of the limitations of the First Amendment. Just like if you walk into a restaurant, just as an example, and you start using a lot of foul language, and the owner of that restaurant or the manager or whoever says, hey, I'm doing that, you can't really stand up and say, just because it's available to the public place, it's still privately owned, just like a repeater. So you can't really stand up and say, hey, I've got a First Amendment right. Yeah, you can go outside there and say whatever you want to, as long as it doesn't affect someone else. One of my government classes that I took in high school, teacher I had, I think said it best. He's like, your rights end where another person's begin. So just keep that in mind. If you're on a repeater or a node or anything like that, you've got to follow the rules in order to use that. If you don't like the rules, get your own. And that's pretty much simple as that. Don't mean to be overly stern about that, but I know there's a lot of people that just sort of misinterpret that. And while politics isn't banned, certain activities such as broadcasting one-way communication to the general public or communications for criminal acts, and you can reference 47 CFR 97.113. If you Google that, if you highlight that or whatever and Google that, it'll give you a little more in-depth explanation, and we'll go into some of that here in just a moment as well. Again, getting into the First Amendment stuff, because I know the political bringing up politics is going to stir up that next conversation, and you and your buddy have every right to discuss politics if you're on the same side, argue politics if you're on the opposite side, or whatever. But there are certain limitations to that with repeater ownership and whatnot. Now, if you're on HF or you're talking direct or whatever, you can do whatever you want to. However, there are still rules when we're talking about First Amendment. There are still rules that prohibit certain communications, like obscene and indecent words or language. Now, I'm going to assert an opinion here, and I don't mean to tie myself to any particular side of anything, because I'm perfectly capable of thinking how the other side thinks, kind of thing, no matter what the argument is. Just like with my children, for example, when they're trying to be mischievous. I was a child once myself, so I can kind of put myself in those shoes. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. As we keep the First Amendment in mind, I want to say that amateur radio is not a right, it's a privilege. There's a reason they print the word privilege on the amateur radio license for whatever class of license you have those privileges. Just like driving a car is not a right, it's a privilege, and those privileges can be revoked or enforced in certain ways. Well, same thing with amateur radio. Right now, the FCC rules, you can't have obscene or indecent words or language on amateur radio. And I know there's certain HF frequencies like 7200, I'll just call them out, where it's pretty commonplace and it doesn't seem like anybody's doing anything about it. I'm sure they've been reported, but looking at it from the other side, from anybody that knows me personally, you know what I do for a living, so you kind of probably have an idea where I can come from on this subject. I, as a matter of opinion, think that there's going to be, the further we go into the future, there's going to be more and more difficulties trying to enforce something like that. And the reason I think that, again, as a matter of opinion, is when you look at broadcast television, for example. If you, I'm a Gen Xer in my 40s right now at the time of this video, and growing up, I remember there was like a couple foul language words you could say on TV. It was very limited. And then all of a sudden, I'm tuned into, I like pro wrestling, obviously, the name of the podcast. I'm tuned into a pro wrestling show, and I hear other words added to that without using those words, because I want this to be a kid-friendly podcast. I hear those words being expanded, and then I'm listening to other podcasts, and I hear some explanations about we're allowed so many of this word and so many of that word. Well, I think when you look at that situation evolving, it's the same FCC that regulates amateur radio. So I'm not saying that they have totally opened the door on amateur radio just yet, but I foresee if there's ever any major enforcement action taken over maybe an F-bomb or the S word or whatever else, and I think it does have to be pretty repeated and egregious or whatever. But I think if there's ever any action taken on that, then there's a good possibility that could end up in even the Supreme Court or the highest court and challenged, and it may not uphold. I don't know. That's not happened yet, but let's refer to a document here that, okay, so this document right here comes from the FCC website. It's labeled as a consumer guide for obscene and indecent and profane broadcasts. This does, if you'll notice at the top of it in this area right here, it does say radio or TV, but it kind of gives a FCC definition of what is obscene. But it also references right here in this section, the Supreme Court actually took this up in 1964, and obscenity and pornography, which obviously, well, I guess slow scan, we could probably end up in there, but the Justice Stuart Potter famously wrote, "I know it when I see it." And the case, it still influences the FCC rules today and complaints from the public about broadcasting objectionable content and drives the enforcement of those rules. In other words, you know it when you see it. It's the same thing, you know it when you hear it. I have seen some cases, though, where the state that I live in, we have a law that and it has a whopping $2 fine the last time I checked, but about obscene bumper stickers. And I've heard of cases for a few years where folks would get that ticket for those bumper stickers, and most of the time for $2 they just go ahead and pay it and pull the sticker off. But I remember one fella actually challenged it, and it was a F word, and the judge pretty much in that case ruled that was subjective and as to being offensive. Now, I don't know that he referenced this case or anything like that, but I just see as society progresses, and I mean progresses as in time moving forward, that that's just a good possibility. I'm not saying go out there and get on amateur radio and just start dropping F-bombs and everything else, but it may drive some people away if that kind of thing gets passed over. But right here, though, they do define obscene content and indecent content. Of course, we're not really focusing on the visual being amateur radio. We're looking at more of what can be said or heard, and it doesn't, according to this paragraph right here, it doesn't have the protection of the First Amendment. For it to be obscene, it must meet a three-pronged test by the Supreme Court and appeal to an average person's prurient interest, depict or describe sexual conduct in a patently offensive way, and taken as a whole lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Just looking at that, and I'm not a lawyer, I will say that, but I do work around law. To me, there's a lot of things that could be picked apart in there in some kind of, in particular in a civil suit, but even in a challenge of any kind of FCC enforcement. So it's one of those things you really don't know until it gets put to the test. But right down here, this one kind of is explicit. Profane content includes grossly offensive language that is considered a public nuisance. So hopefully folks out there, amateur radio, we take enough pride in what we do. I know we're called amateurs, but when it comes to the two-way communication radio, I know we're all kind of considered professional over some of things like CB and FRS and everything. We put a lot of work into this hobby to be able to do it and do it correctly. So I hope, regardless of whichever direction things may go, and I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong as far as a lax enforcement of these types of things. I hope we still stand for what we know makes our hobby great. This right here is the actual, it's from the Cornell Law School website, but it's the actual FCC rule itself that I could find when it come to indecent words and obscene language. So I'll let you see here what it says. Of course, you can't broadcast music, phone emission, except specifically provided elsewhere in this section. Communications intended to facilitate a criminal act. So that's banned. I haven't read that. It's been years since I've read this section, and I kind of forgot about that because I don't know of anybody that uses amateur radio to facilitate criminal acts, and I certainly don't. Of course, you can't encode messages for the purpose of obscuring their meaning except otherwise provided. So you can have like encrypted communications, but on amateur radio, of course, you've got to provide the means to be able to monitor that. Obscene or indecent words or language, which is kind of what we're looking for, or false or deceptive messages. So this right here is kind of the letter of the law, and the FCC with that other document I just showed you tried to further explain it and also reference case law, because that's one of the things that you definitely run into when it comes to what a law says in black and white. It says you can't do this. Well, then you go into case law and what kind of previous precedent decisions have been made and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's my discussion on politics on amateur radio. To kind of summarize real quick, you can certainly have political discussions if you choose to do so on amateur radio. There's no rules or anything that prevent that. Just from an old ham's practical standpoint, try to avoid it because you know what it'll lead into. And of course, your First Amendment rights. No one stops you from saying most anything you want to, anywhere you want to. But amateur radio, just like entering a person's home or whatever else, is a privilege and not a right. Another quick example I can give you that correlates to that was several years ago, one of the NASCAR drivers one time got penalized and had to come to the pits and sit for 3 or 4 laps, however much it was. And whenever they do that, they always have a NASCAR official step out in front of you until it's time for you to leave the pits. And the whole time the official stood there, the driver stuck his middle finger up at the official. And of course, NASCAR, there's cameras everywhere. They saw that and they decided to tack on even more laps to his penalty for doing that. First thing he said when he got on the radio is like, they're taking away our rights. They're taking away what about our free speech and blah, 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 and all that. And I'm like, no, they can't take that away necessarily. But yes, then again, they can. It's simple as if you want to do that, you can do it somewhere else. But they own the tracks. They make the rules. You sign up to obey the rules when you decide to participate. Just like when you get your amateur radio license, you sign papers and you take tests and everything, and you agree to abide by the rules. And if you don't, then you can be fined or even kicked out. So anyway, I hope everyone finds this discussion useful. I think it's something that a lot of folks probably have questions about. And the biggest thing I wanted to do, like I said on that repeater, when I heard that being said, was I knew that was blatantly wrong the way he was saying it. And I just wanted to dispel any myths or any questions that folks have, especially this day and age. There's probably a lot of discussion around this particular topic without even delving into sides. So thanks for listening to the podcast and this discussion. And till next time, this is Adam Dye, the voiceover guy, amateur radio call sign N4NT, saying 7-3.